It was when I realized my eyes had some passion for the pen. Not the mechanical ones, but the ones most of my brothers and fathers have been in, penalizing them with the penetration of those unforeign lines that you have the right to remain silent. Silence is a token that has been given to me that I have carried throughout most of my life. I was always embarrassed about where I came from and who is in my family. I was young when my oldest brother, brother number 1, was sent away for the first time. I was young when my father was in and out of the picture throughout my childhood, me oblivious as to why. I was in high school when brother number 2 was incarcerated. I was in college when brothers number 1 and 3 were locked up. Again. I only had 4 brothers, and yet more than half of them have been incarcerated throughout my lifetime. You were the men I was supposed to look up to, I always thought. The black and brown men who were not a statistic. The black and brown men who were above breaking the law. The black and brown men who were there for their families. Not the men who were criminals. The men who were behind bars. The men who I was ashamed to be related to. The men who altered my perception on what it meant to be black and brown in the United States. The type of men that people shout Black Lives Matter for. Yet I was silent, still carrying this token. I hated you. I projected all men of color as delinquents, unworthy of my love, undeserving of my trust, but worthy of being pigeonholed because you fit the description of a thug or a criminal. You validated my bias from behind bars, and that blackout meant everything to me. But now, with the birth of my baby brother, Dimitri, I have had to take a step back and think about how I don't want him to be a statistic, how I want him to be there for his family, how I don't want him to end up like you. No longer can I be silent. We often consider prisoners in the criminal justice system through a negative light. As you just heard, I saw my own family in such a light. I always thought that if someone did the crime, then, well, they should do the time, right? I had my own biases against prisoners. Now, at this point, I didn't really understand how the system worked, but it really didn't matter to me because as long as criminals were off the street and behind bars, well, I was okay and I was safe. It wasn't until the last year and a half or so after my youngest brother, Dimitri, was born that I've actively began to make an effort to educate myself in order to change that bias. You see, there is a stigma in our society that seldom fades away, and that stigma is attached to prisoners essentially for the rest of their lives. And guess what? We contribute to mass incarceration because we stigmatize people in the prison community. So in order to understand the stigma, we must first understand certain components of the criminal justice system itself in order to understand how it manifests itself. So in our current system, this country uses the concept of retributive justice, or an eye for an eye, revenge. You get what you deserve, or any other type of sayings that you are familiar with, in order to punish and subsequently incarcerate members in our community. Now, these crimes can be either violent, such as battery or murder, or nonviolent, such as theft or drug charges. Aside from that, this country's reflex response to crime is simply to just lock people up. We all know this, right? But think about this. The United States, the 5% of the entire population of the world is in the United States. However, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the entire world. The US houses 20% of the world's population as prisoners. That is no small number. Additionally, thinking about people of color, particularly black and brown people, they make up only 29% of the US population, as compared to white people, who make up 64%. But when we look at the incarcerated population, black and brown people make up 59% disproportionately, as compared to white people, who make up only 39%. It's important to mention these statistics because prejudice is real. And I know it's real because it's affected how I perceive members of my own race, which caused me to think that black men were less valuable, which of course isn't really true. Another fun fact, the average inmate's wage is 93 cents an hour. So in essence, the United States feeds off of prison populations, more often than not, men of color, in order to facilitate its implementation in state and federal institutions throughout our nation, not even including private, which is a whole separate ordeal. So looking at these statistics, we can kind of see that, well, things aren't really going too well, because almost half of former federal inmates can actually relapse back into criminal behavior, which is a term called recidivism. And these criminal acts can lead to what I call the 3 R's: rearrest, reconviction, and a return to prison, with or without a new sentence. My brother number 1, fell into this trap, and he paid the price for it. And he holds himself accountable for it every single day since his release. The lack of adequate resources that people like him don't receive once they are released are one of the things that contribute to this concept of recidivism. So when someone goes to prison, many of their rights, and their human rights, have been essentially taken away, such as the right to vote and the right to access affordable housing. We essentially don't treat prisoners as if they are human. We label them criminals, as I said before, and we deem them unfit for normal life back into society. Whatever that even means, right? But if we are to use this so-called punitive eye for an eye system as a basis for our judgment of people once they are released, we must understand that according to that system, they have been deemed fit for reentry, or else they would still be locked up. But that isn't necessarily the case, because employers can still deny employment based off of their criminal history. So when we look at the institutional level, we can see how the stigma manifests itself on a social context as well. But let me ask you this. Is it possible to implement an additional system, such as rehabilitation, for example, in order to aid in reversing the amount of people who are sent to prison in the first place? Is it possible for prisoners to strengthen their ties with the outside world while they are actually in prison? Is it possible to ban the box on criminal history for job applications? Now, it could be me just being a millennial idealist, but I think anything is possible. We just have to start thinking about what our government can do in order to aid in answering these questions. But more importantly, we have to start thinking about what we can do individually so that your friends and your family members could potentially have the opportunity to succeed in life if they are ever imprisoned. The day that I met my younger brother, Tazuana Johnson, is the day that I wanted and decided that I had to make a change internally if I ever wanted to make that happen. So what did I do? These are a few of the things that I did in order to try to reverse my bias and to overcome that bias of the prison community. And by no means am I perfect. I still have a lot of work to accomplish in order to overcoming that bias, but this is what I'm doing now. So the first thing that I did was I took a class at my university. I have the privilege to do so, so why not? In which majority of the class was to visit a local women's juvenile detention center and interact with the inmates there, in addition to learning about mass incarceration. One thing that I noted while I was there was that these young women were extremely talented in singing and dancing. And one thing that I particularly connected with them the most on was their writing, which was amazing. I could have simply brushed these girls aside due to their inmate status. I didn't have to care. I could have just gone because, well, it was a part of the participation grade, and we all know that participation grade is important for classes. But this was the first time that I truly interacted with people who were incarcerated, aside from my family members. I kept thinking about Dimitri and how he could potentially end up in this situation in a matter of years. And statistically, if you're sent to prison as a child, you're more than likely going to be incarcerated again as an adult. The second thing that I did was I began to work at a nonprofit organization called the Lewisburg Prison Project. The Lewisburg Prison Project provides advocacy, information, and legal assistance regarding conditions of confinement for prisoners and inmates nationwide. Particularly regarding conditions of confinement, we're interested when those conditions are considered illegal or inhumane. And many times, it's both, believe it or not. My involvement with the Lewisburg Prison Project has dramatically influenced my understanding of what's going on inside prisons, such as where prisons are even built in the first place, who has access to certain vaccinations like hepatitis C, flaws in programs like federal good time, which was a program that was used to replace federal parole, to the Eighth Amendment, and what is actually considered cruel and unusual punishment in the prison system and what is not. Through learning about some of these things that happen inside, I have developed more empathy for people or prisoners once they are actually released. I've also developed more questions, such as, what would a better prison system look like? Is it rehabilitation? Is our retributive system, our punitive system actually working? Is it a combination of the two? Is it something else that I haven't thought of yet? How do we push our government to act on fair treatment and prison policies? Is it even possible for our current administration to act on fair treatment and policies in the prison community? Why do we continue to treat these people like animals, like chattel? Now, I don't really have an answer to this question. And if someone in this audience does have an answer to this question, any of these questions for that matter, please let me know after this is over. But I do have an answer to this. How can I, as a member of my national community or within my local communities, get involved and increase my awareness of what's happening in the prison community? Well, one thing you can do is you can write a letter to a prisoner. I know it sounds cliche, but it actually does have a profound effect on both parties involved. Have a conversation with someone who has formerly been incarcerated. Volunteer at an organization such as the Lewisburg Prison Project, in which you can actually do both of the former two questions. More than likely, you'll see that there's not really that much of a difference between those who are incarcerated and those of us who have never been incarcerated in our entire lives. My brothers have all been released. My father is no longer in jail, and they're free. But that doesn't mean I can be happy about it, or that I can be silent about it, or that I can be happily silent about it. Silence is a token, and many of us choose to carry it in our pockets because we have the right to do so. I have chosen to throw my token of silence away. I have decided and challenged myself to do something. My question for you now is, will you? Thank you.